Welcome back to the Crux of the Matter. I'm Landen and Connor.
And I'm Riley Stansberry.
This is a very special episode about education in the United States. And if you are wondering where we have disappeared off to, not to Neverland, not to Disneyland, but to a very special Stansberryan land.
My house. We're in my house. Landon came all the way over from Montana to an undisclosed location in Washington for a couple of days. So while we're here, we figured, forgot about that. We have a podcast, so we kind of need to record new episodes. And that's why you're watching us and the fireplace and these nice chairs and those two pheasants attacking each other, which I think you can see.
Yep. And so, again, if you are only listening to us right now, we do have a YouTube channel, Crux of the Matter. Go check us out. You'll get to see this amazing scenic view of an amazing room here in Stansberry land. And thank you, Riley, for allowing me to come over and see your beautiful house and get to film this.
Yeah.
So, number 12, it is a very special episode, very biblical number, a number of completion. So we have a lot of things today talking about the history of education in the U.S., about the current status quo, why are America's numbers in decline compared to other countries, where has COVID changed the game, so to speak, for classroom learning, and so many other topics, both that apply to you, your children, and your friends and family, and your day-to-day life. So again, we are here covering the core issues at hand. So, what should we talk about first?
Well, I think as far as, sort of the subject that we've centered ourselves around for the episode, we've left it kind of general because I think our podcast skills might be a tad sloppy, folks. It's true. Ooh, wow, I still got it. It's true. But no, we're talking about education today. And so I think, first of all, it would be a good idea to sort of establish where the United States is with education right now. And so everyone is kind of, you see this in especially like boomer conservative sort of circles, like, oh darn, college kids, they're so silly, and kind of these ideas that circulated 10 years ago. And so where is education at right now? Like, what are we seeing from the places that are supposed to represent the greatest intellectual feats of the United States? What's Harvard up to right now? What's Yale up to right now? What's Stanford up to right now? What are these colleges, these universities producing for the United States of value? Like, what are they doing right now? And so I think if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you probably could guess what our opinion is going to be on that. But I kind of find that where education is at right now is, quite frankly, producing a bunch of useless careers that don't really exist. African basket weaving is actually not a useful thing that we need to teach in America.
The good old arts. We love the arts, not saying that.
We do love the arts, but basically the problem with universities is that it's where our new elites come from. It's where the people who are supposed to lead our society come from. It's not actually just a pet project. It's not just something that people go do for fun, even though that's true. But the people who get through college are the people who are supposed to be leading our society. And so, when we look at it, are the people coming out of Harvard and Yale and Stanford leading our society?
That's a great question. And I think to take a step back really quickly is to ask ourselves, when we think of education, do we think of a university, say Harvard, for example? Is that our first kind of mental image of the term education? Because if it is, I want to have you take a pause, reconsider for a few minutes what you think education is, and then continue this episode. Because again, I think us as college students, we get so wrapped in, we are pursuing education, which means we have finished high school, we're going to college so that we can get a job, or so that we can do this and that, so that we can lead, so that we can actually have a prosperous future. But is education solely limited to walls of the modern school system, or is our education much more multifaceted? That is, again, another question. And I think you brought up a great point. Our schools like Harvard and Princeton and Yale, are they generating actual leaders, or are they generating people who have taught how to think, not and what to think? Because yes, there's an aspect, you take some of the most brilliant minds of the nation and you kind of push them into certain schools and you then generate these people. But then again, are you actually maximizing their potential for the nation, or are you actually limiting creativity? Because that's another great question, I think, is are we diminishing creativity by kind of creating these cookie cutter students? I know I've been fit into that category often. It's like, well, when do I have time to think outside of this essay I have to write? When do I have time to think outside of this book that I'm reading? Versus education is really like, look at the beauty in nature around you and look at the classics and actually say, how does this apply to my life? Not just, how can I get this grade for a professor? But education is really like, okay, I can look at my hand and say, where has my hand actually reached out and grasped things beyond the physical, visible world around me? And that is the ability of education, to inspire. Yeah.
I love that. Reaching out and grasping education. Yeah, and I think in a just world, what you're describing is exactly what we would expect to happen. We would expect education to help us reach the stars. You know, we would have people we would have an American version of Shakespeare. We would have an American poet who's like the greatest poet of all time. Well, we kind of have one contender, T.S. Eliot. But, you know, we'd have the greatest artist of all time, or at least up there in the top 5, one of the greatest philosophers of all time. And where has America produced people like that? Like, are they anywhere among us? First of all, are they even out there? These people who are transcending just, you know, oh, I'm just going to class and I'm just getting this grade so I can just get through this year, so I can just get through this degree. And once I get that degree, then I can finally get in the career I want to go into. And then I can like resume normal life. But like, where are the people who use education to kind of not just heighten themselves and the people around them, but by doing those things, heighten all of society? Right. Where's the American ideal? Shouldn't it be coming from universities? And I think that's another question worth asking that we can sort of dive into today.
Yeah, kind of the self-centered approach to education in the modern century. And I think because of especially college debt is a huge pressing topic, very controversial for so many different reasons. Should debt be canceled? Should some be just forgiven? These will be questions we're going to be addressing. But is this debt causing our education to become very narrow-minded for saying, okay, I just want to get this done with, and then kind of leave it in the wayside and say, okay, well, now I have a job and this stability. But is that actually what education's for? Is education just to reach a goal, or is it this lifelong continuation? Because again, we remove the so-called religiosity of life and you're left with the secular world, then it really is just like, okay, you have your own set of morals and values, you try to live up to those morals and values, you try to pursue the most level of success and so-called happiness in how our culture deems those words, and then you live this fulfilled life, whatever that looks like. And I think we're seeing with our generation, that so-called ideal of life is not cutting it. And that goes back to another question of education. Is education, again, teaching us how to think about life and how to think about what we want from life? Or is it just teaching us what to think for what we want? Yeah.
Using education as sort of a means to an end. Do you think that's what education does? Maybe education is too big, but let's just say higher education.
Higher education specifically.
Yeah.
Is it like to grow our GDP? Like we just want to make these new engineers, these new doctors, these new lawyers, these new innovative thinkers to say, okay, let's create this new thing that then helps pull some of the money away from China, pull some money away from other countries, and say, oh, now you want our business. And America's so service-centered now that is education actually being used for the innovative side as much, or is it more for service-centered things? It's a question. But yeah, I think your question of is it just being used as a means to an end is starting to prove more true in my mind on how I see things. And coming across some people, we were out at Coeur d'Alene, a entrepreneur. He was a EMT in New York, crazy trauma center. He was actually pre-med like me, and he left higher education, the so-called educational path, to pursue becoming an entrepreneur, to working for a company to then sell products to others, kind of affiliate marketing. But he's found freedom in that, and now he's actually speaking into high schools about kind of the life issues that a lot of teenagers are facing. And it seems like he had a realization. By leaving the so-called educational system, he became more educated. And some people might disagree with that. It's like, oh, you're just working for someone else, selling products as an affiliate. But there's some sort of enlightening process in that. It's like he sacrificed a lot, working as an EMT, being a pre-med, and he left all that just to pursue that own freedom. And I think there's something there. Yeah.
Yeah. I think sort of as a jumping off point from there, so we have people like this who are involved in the university system, and they're not just people who like have passing knowledge about the universities or whatever, and they don't just like, oh, I read on the news that universities are bad or whatever, or universities are actually very good and there's nothing wrong with them. Like, that's not sort of the person we're looking for. It's like, oh, lots of people in education, they're not necessarily saying, oh, let's tear it all down, or actually everything is good. They're saying there's something off here. It's not producing what it should. And so when you meet people like this EMT, you know, they're like an antenna or
a lightning rod.
Yes, a lightning rod, or they're like something there's something that signals everybody what's going on, like a weather vane. That's what I was looking for. Like a weather vane. Like it tells us where the wind is blowing. And so if someone who's committed to a career path like that, and he didn't just do like 1 year of college, I'm assuming he probably was really invested
into his 20s. So he might have been junior, senior.
Yeah, and then just bails on it and completely switches careers. Is that, you know, maybe it could be because he's whatever, an individual decision maker, but it feels like, just me personally, I meet more and more people like this who are just like, they're so close to the end, and then they're out because there's some sort of transaction going on there. Like, I thought if I put in this time to college and I put all this money into college that I was going to get something out of it, and I'm not getting it. So one thing to ask would be, is it our motivations are bad the way we look at education, or is it that education is not delivering what it actually should? So, you know, I think from there we can sort of say, in order to answer that question, we can look at what's the state of education today, what's going on. And so I think you have something to say about that.
Yeah. So from my perspective, education is an ideal to achieve the highest level of one's ability to live. And that is a very vague statement, something that I've spent not as much time thinking about as I wish I had. But when you look at that level of just cognition, and you think of how you process things, how you apply things, it is kind of this root wisdom. And so if education is not just to give you knowledge, because again, they can force feed knowledge into you, but that will never help a society. They need to instill wisdom. And in order to cause this knowledge to become application-oriented, to become actually useful to a society, there has to be some sort of core understanding of what that social good looks like. And this is where we're seeing an increased divide, is we have some people wanting the social good to be used for specific causes to promote their version of justice, their version of happiness, their version of freedom, their version of safety. And then there's another side who wants this education to be used to kind of connect us to the past, to be well understood of what the past shows us for the future, and to not be ignorant of what these current topics are that have always plagued us in the past, and new causes like AI or different problems that are only facing this technological age, including social media. I think there's another aspect there, is if you think social media is educating us, then if you look to the stats and say, okay, you're not remembering more than 15 seconds of what you just watched. Is that education, or is that just some sort of stimulus? Because a stimulus can be this knowledge-based thing, but it's very short-lived. Your body responds to it, but it ends it very, very fast. And so should education be a stimulus, or should it be wisdom? That's another thing. And I think an audience would always say, okay, wisdom, yeah, we don't want a short-term stimulus. But then look at the world around us. Is that actually what we want? Because it's much harder than the short-term stimulus kind of just keeping us for one more day alive.
Yeah, everybody can say what they want, but you're sort of judged by your actions and not by what you say you're going to do. And so I think that was a good exposition of what education is, its definition. I would say that education, historically, just looking at what it was for, like why did colleges and universities come to exist in the first place? Because they they didn't pop out of nowhere. They didn't just happen for no reason at all. And they're not like a constant. They're not something like human nature that's been there from the beginning. There's something that pops up a little bit later in history, not super late, not super early. Really, antiquity is when education starts being a thing. But the actual model of the university, of higher education, doesn't start until the Middle Ages. And all of the first universities were founded by the church for the purposes of teaching all these bishops and monks to be more knowledgeable about whatever subject it is that they should be engaging with. And so like all the old works of Aristotle and Plato that are preserved, that's the sort of stuff that they're learning at university. But before they learn that, they have to learn things like Latin, and they have to learn things like Greek, and they have to get familiar with the subject material. And so education, when you go and look at what it was originally for, it was primarily to add to the religious experience. And then sort of the way it evolves in the West and in the United States and in Europe is sort of to become this place where it's knowledge that you can't get anywhere else. And so in older times, not ancient times, but in older times, it would have been really, really hard to get your hands on this information. There would be, there's probably less than 10,000, Latin copies of the Bible or whatever in Europe in the 1500s or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
I just made that up.
Pre-Gutenberg press, we'll definitely say it's much more exclusive knowledge.
Right,
so,
exactly. And so after the Gutenberg press, and then after the telegraph, this information that connects us, and now we have sort of almost, maybe not the final form, but one of the later forms of information, the internet. And we've talked about this before, the difference between knowledge and wisdom. The amount of knowledge that is available on the internet is literally better than anything Plato or Aristotle could have asked for, that was in the Library of Alexandria, that all of the popes and their bishops could have asked for in the Middle Ages. It is the most amount of stuff that you could possibly, any answer that you want answered, you can go find on there. But that doesn't make us smarter. The internet is here, and it's like, are we smarter than we were before the internet? I don't happen to think so, because the way we would define smart is kind of stupid, right? Because wisdom is really what we're looking for a lot of the time when we say smart. And wisdom is the ability to make the correct decision with the information that you're given. And so I think that the internet, if it were just about information, the internet would be the new education.
Right.
But if it's not just about information, then education is something higher and something different and something that we can't get from the internet, or at least not in the way that we think of it, like I'm going to Google this and this is the same as me getting a degree.
And the conflation of, I guess, getting answers. We think of that as education in a way. Like Google has become this perfect example of, I have a question, I'm going to go to it. If education is just answering things, then Google's the most educated entity on earth. And so that's another question, I guess, is, is education this ability to answer questions alone? I don't think so. There is something more, something higher you're saying. But as a case study, and to move into the current decline in education in the U.S., I want to take example of language learning apps. You have Duolingo, you have Babbel, you have Rosetta Stone. You have all these applications that have given us so much more ability to learn languages and actually kind of immerse yourself in that culture and language and give you new visual abilities and the so-called cognitive memory learning, research study ability to learn languages. And it seems like it's still just as difficult, if not harder, for the general population to learn. I'm learning to increase my Spanish ability. It should be super simple if these so-called research-based tips and learning strategies are making languages easier. But you look at people from just several hundred years ago learning 4 languages to be a true polyglot. They learned French, they learned Latin, they learned Italian, and say like Spanish like that. Okay, so take 4 of the languages, and they would study it, and they'd actually retain it and they'd use it. We have so much more accessibility today, and it seems like our education has not improved at nearly the same level. And that's one case study of a personal anecdote. Take it or leave it, but it appears that learning languages has not gotten easier. So the question is, why is that? And I think what adds to that is the current statistics on the decline in U.S. education due to the current pandemic that has now ended. So not so current anymore. But you see this quote from the National Center for Education Statistics over the 2020 to 2021 period. You had a national reading drop from 220 points to 215, the largest drop since 1990, and you had a math drop from 242 to 234, the first ever drop in math scores in U.S. history since the starting of this recording process. And that's concerning. I don't know what you think, Riley, but we currently have the most amount of the population that has access to something like this right in my hand. And for those listening, this is my cell phone that I just dropped, so that's even better. And just like that drop, that is our current educational stance on reading and math. It has absolutely plummeted. And I think we can overlook that. We can chalk it up to this pandemic of, okay, schools were closed down, parents were distracted, they couldn't teach their kids. But no, what is education? Is there a natural curiosity in kids to actually pick up a book and read and actually become literate themselves? Is there an ability to give them a whiteboard and a marker, which again, kids didn't used to have. They had chalk, and paper was not quite as accessible as going down to your local store and picking up 100 pages of paper for $1. It's so easy and yet so difficult to teach kids literacy, to teach kids math. And again, what does this come back to? Is it only systemic? Is it something that we should attribute to the pandemic? Mm-hmm. Is it like the actual status of schools? Or is it this fundamental decline in educational ability in the U.S. because we've lost sight of what education actually is?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so one thing we would expect to see, if it were just environmental factors, if it were just, the pandemic, and if it were just online learning, and if it were just everything like that, what we would expect to see is the scores sort of bouncing back, and that's not what's happening. So I think pretty clearly there's a deeper systemic issue with what education is, mm-hmm. and I think in a moment we're going to be able to talk about that. But first, we're going to have to take a little break because we're at my house and it's chill. But we'll be back in a few moments. We're going to wrap up the podcast. We're going to finish this line of inquiry, and then we're going to go a little bit deeper, and we're going to talk about a couple different things. So we'll see.
Stay tuned. Welcome back from the break. For you, it felt like seconds, but for us, we had a basketball game and delicious dinner. Mm-hmm. Our brothers smoked us, didn't they, Riley?
Oh my gosh. It's really annoying knowing that you're at the peak of your athletic capability and you still can't win. So
there's some things even education can't help there. But yeah, so coming back from the topics previously discussed, we're going to be specifically moving in on student loans right after this great quote from the first truly honorable president, George Washington, in a letter to George Chapman. And it is, and I quote, "The best means of forming a manly, virtuous, and happy people will be found in the right education of youth. Without this foundation, every other means, in my opinion, must fail." End quote. Anything stand out to you in that quote?
Yeah, essentially what he's saying is the best way to build up new members of our society is to use education because it will make our progeny the best out of, everyone. And so he's saying that it's an essential component. And the thing that jumped out to me, I actually kind of disagree with the quote a little bit. I can't believe I'm disagreeing with the greatest president of all time. But he says, like, the best way to form them is with education. And I don't think that's true. I think that the people who form children are parents, in the same way that when, as Christians, we walk with God, in the beginning, we're spiritually newborns, like we're still on spiritual milk, like Paul says. And at some point, we're supposed to move on to solid food. And so through that process, like, God is raising us up to be like him, to be sons of God. Mm. And so in the same way, the family is a reflection of God's plan for us, because the father and the mother are the ones raising up the child to be a new creation, essentially. We're participating in the act of creation that God has. And so I think that before we get to education, education's awesome, and I think it's good. I hesitate to say it's actually the foundation of our youth, because I don't think that's true. But I mean, I get it. He's trying to drive a point home. This is how important education is for Americans.
Yeah, that's a really salient point, because I think the extension of that is it takes a village to raise a child. Like, one time I heard that and someone's like, oh, that is very communist ties. Like, I'm like, I don't know if you can go that far, but like, it takes a village, because there is some inherent truth to it. I mean, it takes more than just your immediate family, just your parents, to really raise you and shape you and actually instill those morals and values you love and give you like inspiration and just all the things that make you are everyone around you, your entire environment. But the same point you mentioned, a good point, is it society's like first and noble cause to raise children outside of the home? Like, is that something where you're almost just giving them over to the state in essence? And that's where we can see places like Russia and places like Germany, how you raise the youth, try to instill in them the sense of kind of the social aspect of, okay, do this for your mother country. And then you do have, it takes a village to raise a child, but then you lose the parent aspect of it. That's a good point.
Yeah, and one thing I think is that the biblical narrative is not individualistic and it's not communitarian. It's definitely not either of those. The view that it takes a community and the community is prioritized above the individual is not really there in Scripture, but neither is the idea that it's all about the individual and it's you are sovereign and you make your own choices, because that's definitely not the narrative that's in the Bible, right? I mean, just in a men's Bible group yesterday, just reading with some buddies, and it was just how Moses was humbled throughout Exodus, because he's just complaining like, oh, I'm so, like, why would you send me? I'm an idiot. I'm deaf. I'm not a good speaker. He stumbles over his speech and God helps him through this. But at the end, when he sings Moses and Miriam's song, all he's doing is praising God, because it's not about him. And so I think, to wrap it back to the bigger point, the Bible is not communitarian and it's not individualistic. And I think that education actually kind of splinters into both of these are like, it actually takes the worst of both worlds, where it's like you're a community and everything's for the college. So there's the alumni and the sports teams and everything. But then you get down to the individual and it's like, well, you can do it with whatever you want on your free time on Fridays and Saturdays and Sundays, and tons of people go to parties and get drunk. So it's almost like an inversion of the areas of your life that are supposed to be community oriented, and those parts that are supposed to be community oriented are oriented towards yourself, and things that actually should be oriented towards yourself are oriented towards other people. So I think part of the big problem about how education works is just the campus environment. It's not the same. So like we were talking earlier about the first universities were Christian inventions, and the people who would go to universities would be monks and abbots, and they would stay there completely for 4 years, and that would become their new community. And you see colleges talk about this all the time, like, we pride ourselves on our campus community or whatever. And that's good, and that should be encouraged, but it's kind of weird when the year is split, so you go there and then you go home for break.
It's very fractured.
Yeah, during the semester, and then in between the semester you go home, and then you come back, and there's all these breaks, and so it kind of makes it so, like, just for me personally, it's hard to like lay down roots in either place and be like, hey, I'm committed to like something that I would normally do. Like, hey, I'm going to volunteer at my church. Well, which one is my church? The one that I go to 40 months of the year or something like that. I don't know, 40 months, or the one that I go to for the rest of the months, It's
40 months of the year?
Oh, dear.
That's a long time.
That's too many. I was going to say 20 at first. Yeah, but you know what I mean. It's just like it kind of splits your attention, and it makes it hard to lay down roots. So yeah. I think it's an interesting influence, maybe an angle on education that people haven't heard before. But
yeah, kind of is the short-term suffering what you're working for, just to then take the so-called break on the weekend, or what these things that really just pull you out and then kind of stuff you back in. You're like, oh, it's another Monday. Kind of the cyclical element, which I think rolls over into the work schedule, how people will just work. And that kind of comes back to this human aspect of, yes, life is not always fun. And we've created these things to sometimes numb ourselves to the pain.
Yeah.
That is a great idea for a future episode, kind of going into the nature of pain and how it influences almost every decision we make. But education, is almost meant to help us control that pain.
Right.
And so that could go off on a lot of different tangents, but to kind of rein us back in, I like that quote. So some disagreement from the president himself, George Washington. Great intentions. We can see the nation it ended up raising was we did have people like Horace Mann, the father of the public school, and people during the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution that really did create the modern foundation and the ability we have today to film this, the technology we have, the homes we live in, and just all the extra resources and amenities we have. Really, we have to thank for the educational foundation we were given. Mm-hmm. But moving back to the student loans topic, it has become very, very I guess I'd say present in the news cycles, especially with the Supreme Court ending their decision cycle in June. On June 30th, I believe they announced their decision. And in Biden v. Nebraska and the Department of Education v. Brown, there were some stark decisions that the media was either very poignant, like, okay, this is against the 14th Amendment, the so-called umbrella amendment, where everything has to be equal under the sun. And then others would say, no, they're being pretty constitutional because you can't really add on saying that everyone's debt can be forgiven. And then the actual text in it was, and I quote, this is from the SupremeCourt.gov opinions website, that Title IV of the Higher Education Act of 1965 authorized the Secretary of Education to cancel or reduce loans in certain limited circumstances. And again, we went through a once-in-a-century pandemic, which did create possibly those limited circumstances. But to what extent is that actually good for the economy? What good is that for students? And when we, again, have majors in underwater basket weaving and 14th century African poetry, or even just the art of how nails are made, I mean, these are things maybe we should question, you know? I can't say that my major of biochemistry is like the utmost of importance. I mean, you need a good liberal arts major, you need a good lawyer, you need a good engineer, you need a good musician, because music makes the world sing. So,
and you do need people who will actually fix your kidney because you drank too much when you were young.
Yeah.
I was pointing at him, by the way, for people on audio.
Yeah. So it's something that, it goes back to, is there a different value of majors? And I think we've taken the term liberal arts in a very loose stance. But the question is, so it allowed them to forgive up to $20,000 in student loans to those eligible, which include grants, and up to $10,000 for people making under something like $129,000 a year, which for most college graduates includes them. So the question is, in a country that is already $30 trillion plus in debt, is that something that helps our future generations, the prosperity of our own children, by eliminating that debt, which costs an estimated $430 billion, which some would say, well, we spend more than that in the government military spending each year. That's true. That's true. But do you think that that plays at least a little more importance than a major, which should be able to pay for itself in the long run if it's actually creating value? And I think this is where the dissonance comes in. And feel free to join in, Riley, with how if you are going to school for a major and spending or investing your time and money, and you accrue this debt once you come out, you should be in a place that you feel pretty confident you're going to be able to pay off that debt. And I think a lot of the financially illiterate people that I can't call myself much better than that, I was just fortunate enough to get a scholarship because I feared that debt, knows that when I get a job, when I get a career, when I choose this profession, I'm willing to stay in it for long enough knowing that it gives me the possibility to pay off that debt. And there's a biblical aspect to it. We are not supposed to be in debt to others that could compromise our morals. Yeah.
Right. The Bible actually has a lot to say about interest and debt. And, you're not supposed to loan on interest to anyone except your enemies. There's certain times when that's allowed. And you're not supposed to accrue debt because you're right. It can split your loyalty between God and other people, it's the same reason that Jesus says not to take an oath, right? Just say yes, let your yes be yes, and let your no be no, right? Because if you take an oath, you have to follow through on it because you've made that oath you've not made it on it talks about him who swears by the gold on the ark, or
yes.
is it the gold on the? Is it the sacrifice, or is it the altar which makes the sacrifice holy, or something like that? I'm a little rusty.
But paraphrasing, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, but the point is that it's once you make that oath, it's not to whatever thing you're doing. You have to hold that oath in order to be honest before God, because if you break the oath, then you're an oath breaker and a liar, which is a sin before God. And if you hold an oath that's ungodly, then that's also evil. So you're actually caught in a catch-22 where you have to pick one of two evils, right. And God obviously doesn't want you to do that. So that's why that isn't there. But as far as the debt part of it goes, yeah, part of it is on kids for like taking out all these student loans and not being able to actually guarantee that they're going to be able to pay them back. Because for some people, college is just a social thing. For other people recognize that it actually has to do with social capital and not necessarily the amount of money you make, but that's a separate point. But my main point is that it's not actually just their fault, because if you're a bank and you're loaning money at really low interest rates to 18-year-olds who have never owned a house, and in most cases not even a car, like the bank is kind of the idiot for doing that. And
dangle the carrot.
Yeah, and I don't. There's people who are way smarter than me who have much more refined opinions on what we should do about the student debt crisis. But I mean, I don't think that there's a player in the game that is blameless. Neither the government nor the universities, and also not the kids. I mean, there's to put it bluntly, the whole system is broken.
And I don't think colleges are hurting when they're able to charge quadruple the amount that they used to be able to cost, and I mean much more than just quadruple. When you look at classes used to cost $500 a semester, now at our school like $19,000 a semester. Like there's something going on there, and you could see a very definite spike. I don't have the actual stat with me, but a very disproportionate increase in college tuition costs compared to inflation ever since the 1970s, 80s, 90s. In that 30-year period, you definitely saw a spike. And a lot of people would attribute it towards the government being able to now offer these very lucrative student loans to students needing the money. And it used to be, not always, but for some, that if you couldn't afford it, you couldn't go to college. And I feel very torn, because there's some people who are definitely very deserving. They've worked so hard that if their family can't afford it, then you want to do everything you can to help get them there. And I think that's kind of the merits of scholarships. If we want to live in a true meritocracy, to actually create a better structure of support for those people. But is it to just have a blanket magic wand that says, let your debt be gone, debt you shall not pass? I mean, I can't see that going completely great either. And we can see, I mean, even in middle school, you see that one kid would ruin the whole field trip for everyone else. There's always one. And
get the football taken away. Great job, Jimmy.
Great job. Yeah.
I only say Jimmy because I've never actually met anyone named Jimmy, so I can't get mad at any specific
Watch there
person.
be a Jimmy now in the comments.
That'd be really
Jimmy,
funny.
we love you.
We love you, Jimmy.
But yeah, so just a lot of thoughts going on there. Like as college students ourselves, it's a very, very present topic. A lot of our friends, struggle with it. We were fortunate to be in a certain circumstance which doesn't have us stay up at night and not allow us to sleep, for being like, oh great, there's this ball and chain just attached to my leg for the next 40 years. But for so many out there, I mean, you say the word debt and you can just feel them tense. You can see them tense up, because it is a cloud, and there is an element of that which you want to just say, okay, how can we help out? How can you make the smarter decision to say, I want to be educated, but I don't want to fall victim to this college bubble of saying, okay, I need to do this, when you haven't really thought it through. And that is, I guess, what we'll say about there. To add on to the topic of student loans, there was this issue where, with the Supreme Court, actually had to answer this question. Does the Secretary of Education have authority under the Higher Education Relief Opportunities for Students Act of 2003, called the HEROES Act, actually allow the provisions of the Education Act to establish a student loan forgiveness program that would cancel that $430 billion in debt, approximately? And that is a big topic. So they're trying to extend this to include the HEROES Act and say, under this act, are they able to forgive that much of loans? And so the court's decision was that all this leads the court to conclude that, and I quote, the basic and consequential trade-offs inherent in a mass debt cancellation program are ones that Congress would likely have intended for itself. So here everyone goes, and the media that I've seen a lot of goes, okay, the Supreme Court is off their rocker. They've just kind of cursed all college students to be in this huge debt hurdle, when really they didn't say that they don't want student loan for not forgiven, and they didn't say that they want just no change. They said that it is not in the Secretary of Education's authority by that one individual self. And this is, again, the federalist model. We have these checks and balances, we have these different branches for a reason. The Supreme Court said it is Congress's decision. So then it moves on to Congress, and that is where you have a role to play. You are the direct line to your representative, to your senator, and that's where we have to actually write. We have to be active. We have to participate. We have to inform ourselves. That education aspect really should come down to your local and state electives, kind of the people who represent you, rather than focusing just on the federal level of, okay, well, there's $430 billion in federal debt. We're going to be so mad at this, or, oh, we want this forgiven. Really focus state level. You now have representatives and senators who the Supreme Court just said has the authority to either forgive or not forgive those debts. And that is a pretty big decision. So the ball is in your court, and we'll see what the future holds in that. I am curious, because throughout history, we have not lessened our debt really at all. And so $430 billion, it's depressing, but it sounds like it is just another drop in the bucket. So
yeah, it doesn't even make up 1/30th of the national debt, which you would think
1/60th.
Yeah, I mean it's insane.
Yeah,
I mean, I literally laughed out loud when you said that number, because at some point, like, numbers get so big that they don't mean anything to like a real like it's a real number on a graph somewhere, but it's not like it doesn't mean anything to anyone. Like 500 billion and 30 trillion obviously are way different, but at that point it's like, that's not actually in my headspace, you know? Like, I don't actually understand what that number even means.
Yeah.
So
in a brutal way, wasn't Stalin who said, like, 1 million deaths is
one death is a tragedy, but a million is just a number.
Just a number. Yep.
Yeah, typical commie. So
welcome to monetary psychology in the same way. It's like, oh, $1,000 that you have to pay? Oof. $430 billion that the government has to pay? Nothing. Nah, fine. So, yeah. So that's kind of student loans. Not much more else to say, but I think coming back to the root issue is this new term that I found in a book I'm reading called True Spirituality by Francis Schaeffer. And it's this term called naturalism. And we have entered a very naturalistic period. So ever since the Enlightenment age, kind of Galileo is, of course, one of the kind of people you think of immediately. He was like, okay, maybe we don't revolve, or maybe the sun doesn't revolve around us, but maybe we revolve around the sun. You have Isaac Newton coming up with new theories. You have all these brilliant thinkers. And during that same time, a lot of the authors were very much more concerned with the so-called spiritual aspect, the abstract, the very non-scientific aspect of things. And you could see this dichotomy in the culture. You see the sciences flourish. You have the origin, which Riley and I mentioned earlier, on colleges being definitely founded in Christian values, in really pursuing the good, the true, and the beautiful, the infinite mind of God in a finite world, just things that seemed so out of reach, and yet something that appealed to our curiosity on a fundamental level, that we had to pursue those maths, the sciences, the reading, the literature, the languages, and all that circumambushed that. But at the same level, we have the sciences kind of come in, and that's where this one argument would say in the book, The Sacred and the Secular University by Roberts and Turner, that they ended up having this quote, and I will say, in the sciences, the critical departure from this hegemonic construct took place in the 1870s. They add that methodological naturalism was the critical innovation. And that innovation is a major contributor to what I see as the decline in education in America. And is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think this thing that they're talking about, the methodological naturalism that arises, that I think you're trying to, if I'm correct here, that you're trying to tie to the decline in education because we moved away from Christian values. I actually think that the universities were kind of always going to fail, and that's not any. That's obviously true of all human constructs, but before, the understanding in the world was that the only thing that's like motivating for people to go out and do something is if they're told to do so by authority. And so it's understood in the abstract that because God has authority over humanity, he can tell us what to do. Or the king has authority over the nation, so he can tell the people what to do. Or the father has authority over the children, and so he can tell his family what to do. And actually, it's sort of a trickling pyramid all the way down in that way. And so authority is actually the basis for law. And so education, not really education, but more largely the Enlightenment, took it so that, oh, look, we have reason and we have objectivity. And those are good things, and we should use our reason, and objectivity is good. But what objectivity does is it shifts away from authority, and it makes it so, well, this just is, and it doesn't matter what you or I say about it, which is true about a lot of things. But there's a difference between the thing itself, this thing that I can hold in my hand, and our descriptions of it. So you and I call it a water bottle, and in the Middle East they call it something else. That's not to say that by changing names we're making a different thing. That's not true. The thing is still here. But our conceptions of a thing can be different from the thing itself. And so one thing that science does is it makes it so the thing itself is the description. And so that doesn't seem like a big deal, but when you remove a Christian moral framework from it, what do you have? Well, if you're someone who's sort of a materialist in the Middle Ages and you can't really escape the reality of God and Christianity all around you, the church, and you're trying to get out from its authority, this is actually the perfect place to go. Because you can say, well, actually, objectively, this is true. And that's the opposite of what X thing that the church taught. And so, obviously, some good things came out of that, like the Reformation. Sorry to upset our Catholic friends. But, and there's some bad things that came out of it, which is sort of the modern materialist, the person who C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien are the biggest critics of. And so I think that the sort of age that we're discussing here, the beginning of science and the takeoff of universities and the Enlightenment and all these things, there are good and bad things that came out of both. But what the university is in comparison to the old countries where they have their priesthood, and the priesthood is the authority because it speaks on behalf of God, or the monarchy, or whatever. Insert any human institution that's at the top of whatever society. What we've done is we've put the science at the top. Well, if you can't prove that to me scientifically, then it's not true. Remember, we had our atheists getting very angry with me for that old video that we did on the channel last year, and well, one of the comments was something along the lines of, and it's something you hear all the time, well, if you can't prove to me that God exists scientifically, then I'm not going to believe you. Well, that's really stupid, because the whole and we can explain this to them over and over. Well, actually, no, God is outside of creation. Space-time and matter had a beginning, so something outside of space-time and matter had to create those and get them started, blah, 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 blah. But that actually doesn't convince them, because it's not actually objective. The scientific consensus is not actually objective. What the scientific consensus is a legitimating factor that gives them authority. And so that's why people like Dr. Anthony Fauci, who can be wrong over and over and over again, can appeal to some higher mode of the science, and that makes them an authority. And that makes certain people who are invested in our materialist priesthood, which is really what scientists are, they're materialist priests, those people will line up behind it and follow it. And so it's not to say that education is bad, or that science is bad, or that we should reverse the entire Enlightenment or anything like that. It's just that we should be aware of every time we make an innovation, there will be positives and negatives that come out of it. And this is one of those things where we have to be careful with what education is. So you were talking about, like, we should teach people how to think, not what to think. No, we should do both. Because we can teach people how to think, But if they're a conniving devil and a bad character at heart, that you're literally just making a bad person more capable, which is a terrible idea. So you have to provide the moral framework first, which hopefully is what, in a just world, what parents and the church would do. And then after that, the church and education together can sort of teach how to think. And the church has always been at the forefront of teaching philosophy, especially in this age, because this time period we're talking about is the revival of Augustine and Aquinas and even pagans like Aristotle and Plato. And so it's important that when we evaluate this time period in history, we take it as a whole and not just little bits and pieces and focus on the part that we want to look at.
Yeah, that's a very great description of what's going on. And when you think of naturalism, taking things into consideration of the whole and then just a part is, I think, a core issue. It's really being able to boil down the world to your individual quarks, or the so-called subatomic particles that make up the whole. And if you don't think about what the atom's actually doing, you lose sight of what it is caused or created for. And that is what you're saying, kind of without the whole aspect of why, then you just have the what. You have the substance, you have the form, without the cause, without the reason. And in the book that I was reading, The True Spirituality, it is how even among Christians in today's culture, we so easily drift into this world of just the seen world. And we often lose sight of the unseen world. And so there's one reality, but you have two parts of that reality. You have the seen world and the unseen world. And in the rise of naturalism, we see this ever-increasing proof, the evidence, the so-called visible, or else I won't believe it. And you have metaphors like, well, I can't see the wind, but I know it's there. But like, is that of the same actual persuasion that something like love does? I think love is one of the most overused things in film and culture, but it does have its power because it is true. There is something that science cannot capture, and so of course you see, like with robots, like, oh, they can't feel emotion, but it's there, and it's not just biochemical pathways, it is just something that transcends things beyond what you can prove, but it is a part of reality. It's definitely there. And outside of just that term we so over commonly use in the English language, you then have the religious aspects of what we'd say the Holy Spirit movement, faith, hope, the so-called values that actually are real. And it's something that I am finding and learning more about as I read this book, but I am trying to keep in my head now, okay, you have a seen world and an unseen world. And as a scientific person, you can't just kind of succumb to the naturalistic worldview. And so maybe I'm not persuading of you. I'm like, okay, well, what does this actually convince me to do? Is to just say, really think. How much do you actually know? How much now are you confident that you actually know? Because when you actually face your own ignorance and your own inability to know everything that's out there, then you should really ask yourself, is education teaching you to think smaller, or is it teaching you to think that there's so much more? And I always fall back on the Dunning-Kruger effect. You learn a new topic, so say something like nuclear energy, and you learn that you're warming up steam, basically. That's all you're doing. And you're like, whoa, I'm a nuclear engineer expert. And then all of a sudden you do a little more research, and you're like, wow, the processes of actually obtaining the fuel and actually venting this out and actually securing the area and cooling down and the structural materials and the whole planning around it. And you're like, oh, I know nothing. And so you see a slight peak in your thinking of your knowledge, and then you learn a little more and you think you know less than when you originally started. And that is the beauty and paradox of education, is the more you learn, the less you know. And I think that's what the greatest thinkers always knew. From Albert Einstein to Isaac Newton to George Washington to Augustine to Aristotle, all of them had such a wonder of the world that I think is lost. And education sometimes just loses sight of that in today's world.
I think one thing that all those guys had in common was at one point they were humbled by education. Obviously, not all of them, because some of them existed before, but not all of them by the university system itself, but all of them by way of education, by way of knowing about the world, and not just knowing about it, but knowing the world, which is a different thing, knowing about something and knowing something, just like knowing about someone and knowing someone are different.
I always say in English it's too hard, but in Spanish it's nice. It's saber versus conocer. You have like two separate words for to know to know.
Oh, wow.
Makes it so much nicer. English is terrible.
See, I only speak the best language on earth, so I wouldn't know. But yeah, and I think that the thing they all had in common was they were humbled. So when Aristotle is writing these grand, like, this is what all animals in this category are like, and this is what all plants in this specific category are like, and it seems like, wow, that seems like kind of weird for him to make a statement like all or most or this always happens, blah, blah, blah. He's not saying it because he's arrogant. He's saying it because guess who he got taught by? By Plato. And Plato used to destroy him, and then Aristotle destroyed him later in life. So comes full circle. The teacher has become the master.
You cannot face my pinky toe. Yeah. And so I hope that so far it's been thoughtful. Really think about what is your education actually aiming for. And I think towards the end, just had this fun little quote from Pew Research. And so I'm curious if there's a dichotomy that we often think of too often, is that, okay, the more educated you become, the less religious you'll be. Is this some sort of dichotomy in that the more you know here of the physical world, the less you'll know here about the unseen world? And that's not always true. As Pew Research would actually say, it says, overall, U.S. adults with college degrees are less religious than others. But this pattern does not hold among Christians. Now that is something I did not know. I thought it was pretty monolithic throughout all groups, that the more educated you are, even among educated theologians, I'm like, okay, you don't believe this. You just tend to argue and argue and argue. But you take the most argued over book in existence, and you actually take more educated people, and you actually keep about the same amount of belief or increase the belief on those educated people versus the uneducated, who you'd often say is, oh, they need religion because they're scared of everything, or they just are ignorant, or they don't know. But here you take more educated people in the traditional sense, and you're actually going to have an increase in Christian belief. Something that I just thought was interesting. Maybe if you want to do more research, again, we leave our sources in the description below. And so, yeah, I highly suggest looking at the study. Pew Research, again, one of the most trusted survey groups in the U.S. And
just like how Huggies are the most trusted diapers. No, but that does remind me of this quote, and I feel so bad because ever since you let off with this, I was trying to think of who it is. But the quote is something like, the first sip from the naturalistic sciences will turn one into an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass is a deep belief in God, or something like that. And I can't remember the guy's name. But he was like a very important figure in science, maybe biology. But yeah, and I feel like, because I can literally picture his black and white picture in the meme that I saw the quote in. So
if one of you knows, then yeah, let us know. Now we'll be thinking. There we go. But is there anything else you'd like to add? Any last thoughts? So we've covered everywhere from the history of education to student loans to the current education decline to kind of the Christian naturalistic worldview.
The Enlightenment.
Plural.
Yeah.
The Enlightenment.
So, bringing us back in here, we just had some quick technical difficulties with the camera. We're going to close out just sort of talking about, here's where we're at. Like, universities don't function as they should. And, whatever the reason may be, and we've explored a couple of those, they aren't really delivering what they should deliver. And so, at this point, it's like, where do we go from here? Like, what should we do with the university system? Do we need to kind of go in and restructure it? And the problem is basically that we don't have the right people in education. It got subverted by the bad guys, Marxist infiltration of
the
universities.
Herbert Marcuses and the John Moneys.
Right, exactly, in the 60s and 70s, really back in the 50s as well. And it's the problem with education is really just bad people got in there, so we just have to get good people back in. So sort of like Chris Rufo's project down in Florida, New College, where he basically did a hostile takeover of a university, got rid of the DEI department, fired all the old presidents, and has a bunch of people who he thinks are the right people running in there. And so that's one angle to take. Another is that actually universities have exhausted what little use they had left. And so at this point, it's time to like seize their endowments, go on lawfare. We need to go crazy. We need to like get rid of universities entirely unless there's a handful of private classical education or religious institutions, which is the nuclear option. And that's still kind of hard for me to see. I admit there's
a hard red button to press.
Yeah, there are some people who I respect who hold to that view, but it's kind of tough because there's too much good that could maybe potentially come from universities. Because remember, we were talking about, I briefly touched on how universities are where the elites come from. And so if Rufo is right, that actually we just had the wrong people in there, and we start getting good people teaching at universities who are therefore passing on good values to students who are already good or more blank slate people, and basically creating a new class of good elites, I mean, that could really help, especially if they're explicitly Christian. That would be the best thing for America, because really the only thing that's stopping us from totally tumbling down an awful path is the historic tradition of Protestantism in the U.S. Like that's just true. That's the only reason that it's not as nuts here as it is in certain places in Europe and the third world and Asia and stuff like that. But,
and not to say that those people can't be corrupt too. I think also just more checks and balances as a whole, and not having kind of the overarching power of places like unions, people like those organizations and groups that actually do terrify the final kind of resistors of professors or teachers, almost just like, okay, we'll just teach quietly here, to actually have a voice. Because if this is truly like we value the ability to speak above almost all else in America, then actually create an educational system that allows that.
Yeah, and like one other bit I would add is that there are obviously still lots of good people in universities, and so another is to sort of set up basically just like the alternative economy, like, oh, all these brands are going woke, so let's go to like a more value neutral or merit-based brand, or sometimes explicitly the opposite of the culture brands, which I don't like as much, and basically create a parallel economy except with colleges. The way to do that would be a little bit harder, because part of the reason that colleges seem so crazy and sometimes woke, entropist, or boundless, one might say, is that it's actually financially advantageous for them to do so, because like universities don't just get money from nowhere. They get it from alumni, which is a good bit of it, but mostly from the government through FAFSA and student loans and through how they finance, especially if they're a public university.
And there are strings attached.
Right. And part of it is just they have to hold to government codes. And so some of that is like the newer interpretations of the Civil Rights Act. So now, like transgender, for example, is like a protected class in the same way that black people were in the 60s. And that's just, there's a little bit of a disconnect there, you know what I'm saying? So they kind of have to hold to these certain positions because of the legal and financial incentives. Now, part of those incentives have been messed with because of affirmative action, the decision that was handed down this year, which I think was in June as well.
Yeah.
And so
End of June.
They struck down affirmative action, but sometimes colleges will just get around it. So a lot of people think the Ivy League is actually going to move away from SATs and just go straight to essays, because why even try to go the merit-based route? We actually still want to get there. At this point, it's the commitment to ideology, and they're just like, you know what, screw it. We're not going to let white people in college unless they're already committed to our ideals, and now it's just going to be essay-based. And so whoever writes the essay that appeals best to whoever at whatever Yale, Harvard, whoever's in charge of reading the essays there, whatever impresses them the most, is what's going to get people in. And I have a feeling that it probably won't be the skill of their writing. That probably won't be the only factor.
Yeah. Okay. And to add on to what Riley was saying, and to really quickly interject, is that if you think that we're just being absolute idiots and don't know how to think for ourselves, you're only proving our point more that education has suffered us all. So But to add on to kind of the parallel economy aspect, we also see Turning Point Academy as being an organization that's trying to create an alternative educational pathway for parents who want to have more of a say in what their kids are learning of the classical education that is often missed in today's public education system. We also see that if there's a sense of reclaiming the ability to actually face opposing arguments in a way that is able to be deliberated rather than being attacked and shut down, then we see that as a net positive for education systems. Because in the past it is true, where people in the traditional, I guess, conservative movement who would so-called being in the roles of authority just 50 years ago or less, they would allow contrasting, opposing voices to say what they thought, and then over time it's kind of switched. And some would say, yeah, it's switched completely over, far left of the pendulum. And with that, there's other questions there. Is the group that's always in authority going to just shut out what the opposing party says, saying, okay, well, you are now in disinformation, the so-called scapegoat of the 21st century now, or are you going to actually allow this so-called free speech to be able to exist on campuses without these so-called safe speech areas or the safe zones, and really say, is that what education is meant for? Is it to create a place to coddle your thoughts, or is it a place to actually challenge your pre-existing beliefs, a place to actually grow yourself? Because growth never occurs in a comfortable coddling environment. Growth occurs in places of difficulty and honestly struggle. So I hope that this episode has been helpful. Riley, I'll let you say anything else you want to add.
Yeah, that was a great episode. I'm glad we got to do it here in this house that I live in. I was glad that Landon got to make the trip over. Just on the horizon, we'll try to do our best once the school year starts up here soon on just whenever we can do the podcast, but there's no regular schedule. So we'll just do it when we want to do it, because you know what? It's our podcast.
Yes, and you will stay tuned. So this is the crux of the matter. See you next time.